The neighborhood was the kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. Rows of freshly painted homes lined the winding cul-de-sacs, each lawn trimmed to an exact, almost military precision. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalks, and neighbors waved from their porches with rehearsed smiles. It was the type of suburban development that advertised itself as safe, orderly, and harmonious, a community where rules kept everything in place. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A hidden current of control. A system built not on kindness, but on dominance, and at the center of that system was the HOA. When James Miller arrived, he saw only the good. A retired veteran, he had spent 20 years in service, moving from base to base, country to country, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. But now, with his time in uniform behind him, he wanted roots. He bought a modest home with a wide porch and a small backyard, the kind of house that promised peace. To him, it was more than just a property. It was a chance to finally build the life he had always wanted. James was disciplined, structured, and respectful of rules. He wasn't the kind of man who made trouble, nor was he the type who went looking for fights. He believed in order, but he also believed in fairness. To him, the HOA was just another set of regulations, no different from the codes and protocols he had lived under for decades. At first, he thought it would be no problem. The first weeks were quiet. James kept to himself, working on his garden, fixing the porch swing, and restoring the old wooden fence that bordered his property. Neighbors watched him curiously, some with interest, others with suspicion. Word spread quickly. The new guy was a veteran. Some respected that. Others saw it as a challenge. The HOA president, a sharp-eyed woman named Carol, wasted no time making her presence known. She was the kind of person who believed the neighborhood was her personal kingdom. With her clipboard in hand and her ever-present scowl, she saw every detail as a potential violation. A trash can too visible from the street. A flower bed with the wrong type of mulch. A car parked a few inches over the line. She thrived on catching mistakes, feeding off the power of enforcement. When she noticed James' American flag mounted proudly on his porch, her lips tightened. To her, it wasn't the flag itself, but the fact that it wasn't on a list of approved displays. She made a note, already preparing a letter. The first violation arrived like a warning shot. James found the notice in his mailbox, folded neatly, demanding that he remove his flag or face escalating fines. He read it twice, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Instead, he placed the letter on his kitchen counter and left the flag exactly where it was. Days later, another notice came. This one referenced his fence, claiming it didn't meet HOA standards. James had just spent weeks repairing it, sanding and staining each board until it looked brand new. To be told it wasn't uniform enough felt like an insult. Again, he stayed calm, tucking the paper away, but his patience was thinning. Soon, the harassment escalated. Notices arrived weekly, each one more absurd than the last. His lawn was too tall by half an inch. His porch furniture was not approved. Even the flowers he had planted, bright marigolds and petunias, were deemed non-compliant. It became clear this wasn't about rules. It was about control. And James was being singled out. Neighbors whispered, but stayed silent. Many had been targets before, and most had learned the hard way that fighting back was costly. The HOA had a reputation for crushing opposition, burying homeowners in fines, until they submitted or sold their homes in defeat. But James was not like the others. He had faced real battles, far beyond the petty power games of a suburban committee. And though he didn't want to fight, he was not about to surrender his home to intimidation. The final straw came one morning when James stepped outside to find a bright red sticker slapped on his front door. It declared his property in violation, marked for further action. The message was clear: comply or lose the house. For a man who had fought to protect freedom, the sight of that notice felt like a line crossed. His home, the place he had built as his sanctuary, was now under attack by those who had no right to take it. James stood in silence, staring at the sticker, the weight of it sinking in. He wasn't angry in the way most men would be. His anger was calm, measured, and deliberate. It was the kind of anger forged in years of discipline, sharpened by battles where losing wasn't an option. The HOA thought they had found another easy target. But they had made a mistake. They had crossed the wrong neighbor. And James Miller was about to remind them why veterans were never to be underestimated. James Miller had faced opponents before, some obvious, others hidden behind layers of politics and deception. The HOA, he realized, fell into the second category. They weren't soldiers on a battlefield, but they wielded rules like weapons, striking at weaknesses until their targets gave way. If he was going to stand his ground, he needed more than defiance. He needed a strategy. The red violation sticker still clung to his door when James sat at his kitchen table, notebook in hand. He began listing every notice he had received, the dates, the so-called violations, and the absurd reasoning behind them. His military training had drilled into him the importance of documentation. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency could become leverage. As the days passed, the HOA continued its barrage. Letters piled up in his mailbox, each one demanding compliance, each one threatening fines that grew larger by the week. James carefully filed them into a folder, marking them with tabs, as though preparing for a mission briefing. To John else, it might have looked obsessive, but to James, this was preparation. His neighbors noticed the mounting tension. Some offered quiet words of support when Carol and her HOA board weren't around, but none dared step forward publicly. Many had their own scars from the HOA's relentless campaigns. They had paid thousands in fines, fought bitter legal battles, or been driven to sell their homes at a loss. The board thrived on that fear, using it to keep the community silent. But James wasn't like them. Fear wasn't something that controlled him. It was something he learned to face and dismantle. The first step of his counterattack was small but deliberate. He walked through the neighborhood with a camera, recording every house, every lawn, every fence. He documented every violation the board had ignored, trash cans left out, weeds growing wild, fences in worse condition than his, unapproved decorations displayed openly. He knew the rules better than the board did now, and what he found made him smirk. The hypocrisy was staggering. Carol, the HOA president, often preached about uniformity and community standards. But her own backyard was cluttered with patio furniture not listed in the guidelines, her flower beds filled with plants that weren't on the approved list. James captured it all, saving photos and videos to a secured drive. Once he had evidence, he turned his attention to the HOA's paperwork. He visited the county records office, combing through documents related to the HOA's operations. What he found was worse than expected. The board had been quietly increasing fees without proper votes. Their enforcement actions were often unsupported by state law. Some of their letters were worded in ways that crossed into intimidation and threats, tactics that could easily be challenged. It became clear the HOA was in the just unfair. They were breaking their own rules. Armed with this information, James began to prepare his move. He knew charging in recklessly would backfire. He couldn't afford to become just another homeowner crushed by bureaucracy. Instead, he laid out a plan with the precision of a tactical operation. First, he filed official complaints with the state's housing authority, attaching detailed records of the HOA's behavior. Then he reached out to a lawyer, someone with a reputation for dismantling corrupt aid. The lawyer listened carefully, reviewing James' notes and evidence, and quickly agreed the case had merit. Meanwhile, James continued to live his life as normally as possible. He mowed his lawn, repaired small things around the house, and kept his flag flying proudly. Outwardly, he looked like a man ignoring the HOA's harassment. But behind the scenes, he was building a case strong enough to topple the very board that had targeted him. Carol noticed his calmness and mistook it for weakness. She bragged during board meetings that James would soon fold, just like the others. She even had the nerve to order a lien placed on his home, claiming unpaid fines gave them the right to seize his property. That was her fatal mistake. The notice of the lien arrived one Friday evening. James stood on his porch, holding the letter under the fading light, his jaw tightening. To the HOA, this was the end game, the final weapon to force him into submission. But for James, it was the moment he had been waiting for. The HOA had overstepped. They had gone from petty harassment to a direct attack on his right to keep his home. With the letter in his hand, he felt the calm, focused determination he used to feel before a mission. The board had underestimated him, and now they had given him the opening he needed. The next morning, James called his lawyer, forwarding the notice. Together, they mapped out the next steps. Not only would they fight the lien, but they would expose the HOA's violations in court. What the board didn't realize was that James wasn't alone anymore. His quiet resilience had caught the attention of neighbors who had suffered under Carol's reign. Slowly, they began approaching him, sharing their own stories, their own evidence of harassment and corruption. They had been too afraid to speak before, but now, seeing someone willing to fight, they found courage. James listened carefully, collecting their accounts. The HOA had ruled through intimidation for years, but fear only worked until someone proved the enemy could bleed. The battle lines were drawn. The HOA had seized property before, crushing families with their unchecked authority. But this time, they had chosen the wrong man. They had chosen a veteran who understood strategy, who thrived under pressure, and who knew how to turn their own weapons against them. And soon, the entire neighborhood would see what happened when the HOA's greed collided with the unshakable resolve of a man who refused to be broken. The notice of Leanne had been meant as a death sentence for James Miller's peace of mind. For most homeowners, it was the end of the road, a financial chokehold that forced compliance or forced them out. But for James, it only hardened his resolve. The HOA had fired their heaviest weapon too soon, and now they had given him the perfect opportunity to strike back. Word of the lien spread through the neighborhood quickly. Neighbors whispered about it during morning walks, exchanging glances when James passed by. For years, they had seen others crumble under similar pressure, losing their savings and their homes. But James was different. He walked with the same steady confidence he always had, his eyes sharp, his posture unshaken. The HOA expected fear. Instead, they saw calm defiance. Carol, the HOA president, mistook his composure for arrogance. At the next board meeting, she announced that James' property would soon be under the HOA's control. Her words drew nervous laughter from her loyal board members, but even they sensed her overconfidence. She was pushing harder than ever, driven not by justice, but by ego. Will. James and his lawyer were preparing a counterstrike that would shake the very foundation of the HOA. James compiled his evidence into a comprehensive dossier. Each violation letter, each photo of ignored infractions, each instance of the HOA breaking its own bylaws was carefully documented. His lawyer began drafting legal motions, not just to fight the lien, but to challenge the HOA's authority outright. They were no longer playing defense. They were preparing to dismantle the enemy's power structure. But James wasn't just working through the courts. He understood the value of morale, of building allies. Quietly, he reached out to neighbors who had confided in him. He encouraged them to share their experiences, promising they wouldn't be alone this time. Slowly, people who had once been silent victims began to speak. A couple on the corner admitted they had been fined thousands for their choice of paint color. Another family revealed the HOA had harassed them for putting up a swing set for their children. Elderly residents recalled being bullied into paying for special assessments that had mysteriously vanished from the community's budget. The stories were endless, and each one fueled the growing resistance. James didn't rally them with speeches or promises. He simply listened, documented, and reminded them that together they were stronger than the board wanted them to believe. His quiet determination was contagious. For the first time, neighbors began to see the HOA not as an untouchable authority, but as a corrupt machine that could be challenged. Meanwhile, Carol doubled down on her attacks. She ordered security patrols to pass James' home more frequently, hoping to intimidate him. She instructed board members to file complaints about trivial issues, from the angle of his trash bins to the color of his mailbox flag. The harassment was relentless. But every move she made only added to James' growing archive of evidence. Each petty action became another nail in the HOA's coffin. The tension reached a boiling point one morning when James awoke to find a bright orange sign staked into his front yard. It declared his property in violation and warned of impending seizure. It was a public shaming tactic, designed to humiliate him in front of the entire neighborhood. Instead of removing it, James took photographs from every angle. Then he left the sign where it was, turning the HOA's weapon into a badge of defiance. Neighbors passing by noticed. Some shook their heads in sympathy. Others stopped to talk, quietly expressing their disgust with the board's behavior. What had once been a community ruled by fear was slowly turning into one united by outrage. Behind closed doors, Carol grew restless. She couldn't understand why James hadn't broken yet. Every tactic that had crushed others only seemed to make him stronger. She saw his growing influence among neighbors, the way people gravitated toward him, and it made her furious. To her, this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was personal. She wanted to prove that no one could stand against her authority. But her determination blinded her to the storm she was creating. James' lawyer filed a lawsuit challenging the HOA's lien and their pattern of harassment. The filing didn't just defend James, it opened the door for every resident who had been wronged to join the case. Suddenly, the HOA was facing not just one man, but a community ready to fight back. As legal papers were served, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Neighbors who had once avoided confrontation now walked with their heads higher. Conversations that had been whispered in secrecy were now spoken aloud. The HOA's grip on the community was slipping, and Carol knew it. Still, she refused to back down. She scheduled an emergency board meeting, determined to push forward with her plans. But what she didn't realize was that James had already begun preparing his next move, one that would expose the board as hypocrisy in front of the entire neighborhood. The battle was no longer just about one man's property. It had become a war for the soul of the community, and James was determined to win. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. For years, these gatherings had been dull affairs, attended by only a handful of residents. Most people avoided them, knowing Carol and her loyalists controlled the conversation and silenced dissent. But this time was different. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that James Miller was coming prepared, and curiosity pulled people out of their homes. When the meeting began, the community hall was more crowded than anyone could remember. Folding chairs filled the room, with neighbors lining the walls when the seats ran out. Carol sat at the head of the long table, her clipboard in front of her, her expression smug and unyielding. She believed this would be her moment to humiliate James, to demonstrate her authority in front of everyone. But James didn't walk in like a man defeated. He entered calmly, his folder of evidence tucked neatly under his arm. His posture was upright, his face composed, the same quiet discipline that had carried him through deployments now guiding him into this battle. Neighbors watched him with anticipation, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The meeting opened with Carol rattling off minor violations around the neighborhood. She droned on about paint colors, lawn heights, and approved fence designs. But the crowd's attention was elsewhere. They were waiting for the confrontation everyone knew was coming. When Carol turned her sharp gaze toward James, she announced his alleged violations with relish. She listed the fines, the supposed failures to comply, and the lien placed on his home. Her words dripped with confidence, as if she had already won. Then, James stood. Without raising his voice, he placed his folder on the table, opened it, and began to lay out the evidence. One by one, he displayed photographs of homes throughout the neighborhood, homes with the same supposed violations that had been ignored by the board. He showed Carol's unapproved patio furniture, the board treasurer's peeling fence, and the vice president's overflowing trash cans. Every rule they had used against him, they had broken themselves. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes widening as they recognized their own homes, their own frustrations reflected in James' meticulous records. Then he revealed the documents he had pulled from county records, proof that the HOA had raised fees without proper approval, that money had been spent without transparency, and that the lien on his property was filed improperly. The room buzzed with shock as James methodically dismantled the illusion of fairness Carol had worked so hard to maintain. For years, the HOA had thrived on secrecy and fear. But now, under the fluorescent lights of the community hall, their hypocrisy was laid bare for all to see. Carol tried to interrupt, her voice sharp and dismissive, but the crowd wasn't with her anymore. Neighbors who had once nodded in silence now spoke up, demanding answers. One by one, voices rose, each carrying years of pent-up frustration. They asked about their own fines, about missing money, about the board's double standards. The tide had turned, and Carol no longer controlled the room. James didn't shout, didn't accuse with anger. He simply stood his ground, presenting facts with the steady calm of a man who had seen far worse battles. His strength wasn't in his volume but in his undeniable truth, and the more he spoke, the more the neighbors rallied behind him. By the time he finished, Carol's confidence had cracked. She sat stiffly in her chair, her face flushed, her clipboard untouched. The authority she had wielded for years had evaporated in a single night. The meeting ended in chaos, not the order Carol had expected, but a wave of residents demanding reform. Some called for her resignation. Others demanded a vote to remove the current board entirely. For the first time, the HOA was no longer feared, but challenged. As James walked out of the hall, neighbors followed him, thanking him, shaking his hand, offering their support. What had started as one man's fight had become a movement. The community had seen the truth, and they were no longer willing to be ruled by intimidation. But Carol wasn't finished. Humiliated and furious, she retreated into the shadows, already plotting her next move. She wouldn't let go of her power, so salí. James ganó y tú. The battle wasn't over. It had only shifted to a higher stage. Now that the truth was out, the HOA would fight harder than ever to protect what they had built, and James was ready. The fallout from the community meeting left the HOA shaken. For the first time in years, residents openly questioned their authority. Carol, the president, who once thrived on absolute control, now felt her grip slipping. The smug confidence she displayed had been replaced by a simmering anger, and she wasn't about to let James Miller's victory stand unchallenged. Within days, new letters appeared in James' mailbox. The board accused him of defamation, claiming his statements at the meeting had damaged the HOA's reputation. They threatened legal action, promising a court battle that would teach him a lesson. Carol was determined to drown him in paperwork, to exhaust his resources and force him into submission through sheer persistence. But James had been preparing for this. He had lived through conflicts where the enemy tried to overwhelm by force. He knew that brute pressure, without strategy, often led to collapse, and unlike many homeowners before him, he wasn't alone anymore. His lawyer immediately countered the HOA's threats with formal responses, reminding them that everything James had presented was documented evidence, not slander. Any attempt to sue would only expose the board further. Still, Carol pressed on, pushing the board into approving funds for a legal fight. She believed that if she could bleed James financially, she could still win. The decision backfired almost immediately. To fund their case, the board levied another special assessment on every homeowner, demanding hundreds of dollars from each household. This time, instead of quietly paying, the residents erupted in outrage. They had heard James' evidence. They knew where the money would go, not toward improving the neighborhood, but toward protecting the board's pride. Neighbors who had been silent for years began organizing. They met in living rooms, backyards, and over kitchen tables, discussing ways to challenge the board. James, though central to the movement, never tried to lead with force. Instead, he encouraged others to step forward, to take ownership of the fight. His calm assurance gave them confidence, and soon, a petition circulated demanding the removal of the board. Meanwhile, James continued building his legal case. With his lawyer's help, he filed motions not only to dismiss the HOA's baseless threats, but also to challenge the validity of their lien and their misuse of funds. Each filing struck at the heart of the HOA's power, forcing them into defensive positions. The pressure mounted. At one particularly heated board meeting, Carol insisted on pursuing the case against James, but cracks were forming within her circle. Some board members, once loyal, began questioning her decisions. They saw the growing unrest among neighbors, the mounting legal bills, and the possibility that they could personally be held liable. Fear began to shift sides. Still, Carol pushed harder. Her obsession with defeating James, blinding her to the damage she was causing. She ordered more violation notices against other residents, hoping to intimidate them back into silence. But, instead of compliance, she met resistance. Residents openly defied her, pointing to James as proof that the board's power wasn't absolute. The tipping point came when a local news outlet picked up the story. A reporter, tipped off by one of James' neighbors, arrived to cover the growing rebellion in the quiet suburban community. Cameras rolled as residents spoke of harassment, fines, and intimidation. James, ever composed, shared his story not with bitterness, but with clarity. He explained how the HOA had crossed the line, how they had targeted him unfairly, and how their actions threatened the very idea of home ownership. The story spread quickly, casting the HOA in a harsh light. Carol, once the unquestioned authority of the neighborhood, now found herself portrayed as the face of greed and abuse. Her furious denials only made her look worse. The legal case dragged on, but with the weight of public scrutiny, the HOA's position weakened. Each time they tried to push forward, James and his lawyer countered with facts, evidence, and the growing support of the community. What had once been a one-sided battle had become a war the board couldn't win. Still, Carol refused to resign. Her pride wouldn't allow it. She clung to power with desperate determination, even as the walls closed in around her. The community was organizing for a vote to remove the board entirely, and James knew the end was near. The fight had been long and exhausting, but he could feel the momentum shifting. The HOA, once feared and untouchable, was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption, and the very residents they had once controlled were now rising against them. James had turned the battle into something bigger than himself. It was no longer just about saving his home, it was about liberating an entire neighborhood from tyranny. And soon, the final showdown would come. The day of the community-wide vote arrived with an air of anticipation that could be felt in every corner of the neighborhood. For years, residents had trudged into HOA meetings out of obligation, their voices ignored, their complaints dismissed. But this time was different. This time, they weren't gathering under the weight of fear, they were gathering with hope. The community center was packed to overflowing. Families who rarely attended showed up in force, some carrying folders of their own violation notices, others simply eager to watch history unfold. The energy was electric, a mix of nervous tension and quiet determination. Everyone knew what was at stake. The future of the neighborhood, and whether it would remain under the iron grip of the HOA board or be reclaimed by the people who actually lived there. At the head of the room sat Carol, the embattled HOA president, her face tight and pale. She clutched her clipboard like a shield, though even she seemed to realize it no longer commanded authority. Beside her, the remaining board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the inevitable. Some had already distanced themselves from her decisions, whispering apologies to neighbors. But Carol's pride held her locked in place. James Miller entered quietly, just as he had at the last meeting. He didn't come with bluster or theatrics. He carried only his folder of evidence. Tug by now, everyone in the room knew its contents by heart. His calm presence seemed to steady the room, a reminder that this wasn't about anger, it was about justice. The meeting began with Carol attempting to assert control, rattling off the agenda and insisting that false accusations had been spread. But her words fell flat. Too much had happened. Too many truths had been exposed. The crowd didn't fear her anymore. When the floor opened for discussion, residents lined up to speak. One by one, they told their stories of fines that drained their savings, of threats that kept them awake at night, of dreams of homeownership turned into nightmares. Each voice added to the weight of evidence against the board. The room filled with a collective sense of grievance, but also with relief. For the first time, they were being heard. James didn't rush to the podium. He waited until many others had spoken, then stood and walked forward with the steady composure of a man who knew the outcome was already decided. He laid out the facts one last time. The improper liens, the illegal fee increases, the hypocrisy of selective enforcement, and the personal vendettas that had turned the HOA into a weapon of control. His words were clear, concise, and irrefutable. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, not the polite clapping of past meetings, but genuine, thunderous approval. Neighbors who had once been strangers now stood together, united by a shared purpose. The vote was called, ballots were distributed, filled out, and collected. The counting took only minutes, but to those in the room, it felt like hours. Finally, the results were read aloud. The board was dissolved by an overwhelming majority. Carol and her allies were removed from power. The room exploded with cheers. Some residents wept openly, hugging their neighbors, while others simply stood in stunned relief. The years of fear, fines, and frustration were over. Carol sat frozen, her clipboard slipping from her hands. For years, she had ruled with unchecked authority, but in the end, her downfall was swift and absolute. Her power had crumbled not because of some grand betrayal, but because one man had dared to stand and say no. Without another word, she gathered her things and stormed out, her legacy reduced to whispers of resentment. James didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate loudly. He simply exhaled, the weight of the battle lifting from his shoulders. He had fought not just for himself, but for everyone, and now the neighborhood was free. In the weeks that followed, the community came alive in ways it hadn't for years. Without the constant shadow of the HOA, neighbors began working together to improve their homes, their gardens, and their shared spaces, not out of fear of fines, but out of genuine pride. Barbecues returned to driveways. Children played more freely, and the tension that had once hung heavy over every block slowly dissolved. James remained a quiet presence. He never sought recognition or leadership, but his neighbors saw him differently now. To them, he wasn't just the veteran who had moved in quietly one day. He was the man who had saved their homes, their peace, and their community. For James, the victory wasn't about pride. It was about principle. He had faced the HOA's greed and intimidation, and he had stood his ground. In the end, discipline, patience, and truth had prevailed over arrogance and corruption. The HOA had thought they could break him. Instead, he had destroyed their reign. And as James sat once again on his porch, the flag still flying proudly above him, he knew one thing with certainty. Sometimes, the fiercest battles aren't fought overseas. Sometimes, they happen right at home.